All right, it is 12 o'clock. Welcome, folks, to the Iowa Learning Farms Conservation Webinar Series. Greatly appreciate folks taking time out of their busy schedule to attend one of these. As I said, if you saw my blog the last week, this is one of my favorite times of the week, is I get the good fortune to help moderate these webinars, and I get to listen and learn just like the rest of you. And so I missed it last week. But if you're interested in wetlands, Dr. Jill Costell has, that's archived now on the Iowa Learning Farms webinar site. And so this week, we are really fortunate. Again, we're going out of state again, but Dr. Jennifer Tank, that's in the Gala, am I saying that right, Jennifer? Is it? Yeah. Okay. Professor in the Department of Biological Sciences at the University of Notre Dame to talk about two-stage ditches. So I think something that we all should better understand. And I think we're getting maybe a first two-stage ditch in Iowa that Keith Schilling is involved with. So hopefully it can be more in the future. So as always, if you have questions for Dr. Tank, feel free to type those in the chat box and we'll get those to her at the end. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Tank.
That's great. Thanks, Matt. I really appreciate the invitation to talk to you all via the webinar series. It's a real honor. And yeah, looking forward to sharing our work on the two-stage ditch, sort of the saga that started in about 2007 and continues to the present. So let's get started. I probably don't need to convince this community that streams and ditches draining row crop agriculture are leaky systems. Just to give an Indiana perspective, where I'm based, more than 90% of the 30,000 miles of Indiana streams and ditches are less than a third of a mile from row crop. So water and agriculture sit side by side in Indiana. And we know that fertilizer inputs, channelization, subsurface tile drainage, which we have a lot of, these are all essential tools for productive agriculture. But they result in a reduction in channel stability and nutrient retention that can cause problems downstream. And we hear a lot about those challenges, increased export of excess nutrients and sediments to downstream water bodies, especially during snow melt and spring storms right around this time of year, are a real challenge. And it gets some high profile attention. I'm sure you all have been somewhere where someone asked you about the hypoxic zone or dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. So these excess nutrients in the upper Mississippi River Basin flow downriver, fuel algal blooms that eventually die and decompose and result in low oxygen conditions over a large area in the Gulf of Mexico. It varies year to year, but it's been happening since the mid-'80s. And our challenge is to sort of do agriculture better in the upper Mississippi River Basin in order to minimize these down system impacts. So we haven't had thank goodness, a giant year in a couple of years. But depending on what the precipitation looks like, it's always a potential. We know from climate change impacts assessment that usually happen at the state level. Our Indiana INCIA study projected that by 2080, we'll have a 45% increase in those common 100-year storm events. We'll see them a lot more frequently. And I know just in the 15 or so years we've been working in the system, the Chateau Ditch in our area, we've seen many more of these. That combined with tile drainage is going to result in a lot more export from these agricultural systems. And just from my home watershed, where I sit right now in the St. Joseph River Basin, we're really seeing a change in the overall peak stream flow or river flow in this system. And then we're getting these giant events. February 2018 is an example you can see from the red dot. That was a 2,500 year flood event. And it flooded the city of South Bend. So the challenge really is, how can we maintain productive agriculture, maintain drainage, while preventing nutrient and sediment loss to adjacent waterways, especially during these predicted high flows that are going to become more common. So I want to tell you about the Chateau Ditch watershed, where the two-stage ditch has been, we've studied the heck out of it. So it was a great opportunity that started in about 2007 in partnership with the Nature Conservancy. The watershed is located in Kosciuszko County, Indiana. It's a second-order tributary to the Tippecanoe River, which is kind of a high-profile river in Indiana because they call it one of the last great rivers. It has endangered freshwater mussel species that folks are really worried about. And so this little tributary to the Tippecanoe has been quite important as a long-term study site. It's about a 3,300 acre watershed, and the land use is about 75% ag and row crops, corn and soybean rotation. And this is a system, we use this as a demonstration project for the two-stage ditch for the state. And we picked a system that has high nutrients year round. So it was a good system to work on because it's a system that needed some assistance. It's also a reasonable size to work in. The base flow discharge out of this system is about 100 liters per second. That's a sort of a stream ecologist way of thinking of how big that is, but it's, knee high basically, and about 5 or 6 feet wide during base flow. But boy, that discharge can really vary depending on flow. And we get a lot of precipitation like you all do in Iowa. This is our precipitation record. This shows 2012 to 2018 record, just a snapshot, but you can see these flashy events. And the flow goes up with precipitation and comes right back down. So here on the right is this is the watershed outline. It looks sort of like a boot, and it's flowing from here in the headwaters to the outlet at the Tippecanoe River here. So it's flowing up on your screen. And this is what base flow condition looks like in the system. And then this is what storm flow looks like. So it's a real flashy system, very typical of agricultural streams. So what I wanted to talk to you about today is the two-stage ditch, and we started in 2007 with a half-mile demonstration project. And so this little schematic has been used, probably in every paper ever published on this. But here's what a conventional agricultural ditch, and we have a lot of subsurface tile drainage. So this gives you a reference with the tile drain flowing right into the trapezoidal ditch, so bank to bank, about 10 foot wide. And you can see that we have low flow and high flow conditions. It's just, it just increases in flow, and the velocities get really high. Here's the alternative. The two-stage ditch basically has that same low flow main channel, but instead you pull back and create these mini floodplains that triple the width of the waterway from 10 feet to about 30 feet. And these floodplains inundate during storm events. And you can see the tile drain flowing onto the floodplain instead of into the main channel. So in addition to efficient drainage, the two-stage ditch offers some co-benefits. One, it really reduces ongoing maintenance costs. Because during high flow, the velocities are higher in the main channel, there's a self-cleaning. And so you don't need to dip the systems, whereas the traditional sort of trapezoidal shape in our area needs to be dipped every once in a while. You get reduced overbank flooding and bank failure, which was the real reason why Andy Ward at Ohio State University sort of developed and proposed this two-stage ditch as an alternative strategy for managing waterways. Those bank failures are costly and environmentally challenging. But then the third co-benefit hadn't really, at least in 2007, hadn't been studied. How does it improve water quality? It should, adding those floodplains in, but no one had documented it. So that's where the demonstration project started. And here's just a visual of what the two-stage, this reach and the Chateau ditch looked like before. They already had grass buffer strips in, but this is the waterway. Here's what it looked like during construction, where you're pulling out those floodplains, and then notice not touching that main channel at all, just with the backhoe pulling away to create these floodplains about 10 to 14 feet wide on each side. And then after one growing season, this is what that reach looks like. So let me show you what it looks like during the time when it's supposed to be working, and that's during storms. So actually, that came really quick after construction of that first half mile. We constructed in December and got a 200-year flood event in January 2008, and I thought we were done for. But in fact, you can see the main channel, those tufts of grass, and then you can also see the floodplain that doesn't even have any vegetation on it yet, already retaining sediments, because when that water flows out under the floodplain, the velocities slow way down and drop the sediments on the floodplain. Here's though what it looks like during a storm now, with those vegetated reed canary grass mainly on these floodplains, and then the main channel. And so one of the first things we looked at was how often are these wet? How much work are they doing, and when are they doing it? Well, we had a couple of years of data that turned out a really wet year and a really dry year. So 2011 was a wet year, and we found that during a wet year, up to 150 or so days, you can have water on those benches, on those floodplain benches, doing work. But it is there are more days inundated the shallower the benches are. So the lower the benches are, the closer to the stream bottom, which means they're going to flood more frequently. In a dry year like 2012, that may be reduced to about 50 days per year. But the take home was that storms inundate the two-stage floodplains, but the duration varies during wet and dry years, and lower benches flood more frequently, so they do more work. And I just wanted to show you some pictures of that, because I think that really sort of captures it best. The picture's worth 1,000 words. This is a reach of the two-stage ditch. Here's the culvert, and you can see those floodplains. This is during spring. It's wet. You can see how it's quite wet. And here's the floodplains. And then notice this little rebar stake right here. There's right after 2.5 inches of rain, and you see how we've inundated the floodplains here. We still no overtopping of banks. There's the rebar, and that was a good rain event. We get about 10 flood events per year with no overtopping of the banks in Chateau since 2007. And just to show that even further, I'm going to show you what it looked like just a few weeks ago in our system. It's cold and it's snowy. It looks like winter. But we got around February 16th, a big rain on snow event, which is sort of dreaded around here. So rain on snow on February 16th. You can see the flow at the Chateau ditch. This is the USGS gauge rising rapidly. And here's what that looks like. So again, I mean, it's bank full. There was flooding in the rest of the county in these small waterways. The Chateau ditch held its flow, which was very exciting. Rain on snow is sort of the worst combination, and it seemed to hold in this past month. So what does this two-stage do in terms of water quality? That was really the contribution that we set out to make to the work. Well, the take home is that these added floodplains adjacent to the main channel reduce sediment, and those sediments have associated phosphorus, and it reduces the phosphorus as well. So let me show you what the approach we took early on was that to compare downstream of the two-stage ditch reach, usually about a half mile, to the upstream channelized reach. And you compare those, and this is, we have permanent sondes out at a number of systems during this first study we did, including the Chateau ditch, which is in red. And what you see is this water column turbidity in NTU. It's a probe that we deployed out there, a Hydrolab mini sonde. And you can see that we get reduced turbidity or water column cloudiness in the below the two-stage ditch compared to the upstream channelized reach. And that was pretty significant, pretty consistent, statistically significant across a number of the systems that we were looking at, 5 out of the 6 systems. This one system where there was no difference happened to be only one-sided, a one-sided two-stage, which we didn't see as significant. The rest of them were two-sided systems. And what we also measured is that the soluble reactive phosphorus, those that loosely sorbed phosphorus to those particles, was also lower when you compare the downstream two-stage collection point compared to the upstream channelized reach. So the mechanism for that is that this floodplain inundation that happens during storms slows the water down, the sediments drop out of the water column, settle on the floodplain, and the loosely associated phosphorus, soluble reactive phosphorus, or DRP, dissolved reactive phosphorus, also settles with it. Now shifting to nitrogen, the process that we've done the most work on has been denitrification, which is a microbially mediated process that permanently removes nitrogen from the water column and is blown off as nitrogen gas. That represents a permanent sink for nitrate nitrogen, which is great in terms of a water quality improvement. And what we did is a series of repeated lab assays where we collected sediments, floodplain sediments, and floodplain soils and stream channel sediments, and measured the denitrification potential of those sediments in the laboratory using these assays. And what I show on the left is the N removal capacity, the nitrate nitrogen removal capacity in kilograms of nitrogen per kilometer distance of two-stage per day. And what I just want to emphasize to you again across these multiple two stages, including the Chateau ditch that we studied, the stream is the waterway itself is the main channel, is contributing some nitrogen removal. But then you add these two-stage floodplains to the side, and that really increases the bioreactive surface area. So you can increase the nitrogen removal by 3 to 24 times just by adding that additional bioreactive surface area. So floodplain N removal improves, and it also improves with time. And the mechanism is that enhanced nutrient retention, by tripling the width of the system, we're increasing the bioreactivity, and those microbes can do their job. And these 6 systems, the way we set up the work was these had already been built, and then the Chateau ditch was new. We compared these different ages to see how the two-stage does over time using a time for space substitution. Another thing that people have asked us about the two-stage, the two-stage just gets constructed, and they can do that in a couple of, it doesn't take long. The backhoes, I think it was over a week, we were done with the half mile, depending on how the skilled sort of company that you hire to do it. And so that's this rapid construction of the two-stage. How does that compare with floodplains that naturally form in these channelized ditches when you don't maintain them, when you get the banks slumping and the accumulation of sediments by simply not maintaining or not dipping the system? So one of my students, Brittany Hanrahan, worked on this question. She looked at a naturalized reach in the Chateau ditch upstream of our two-stage, and here's the restored two-stage reach that I talked about, that initial half mile, and compared these two to see if naturalized, meaning just stop maintaining the ditch, versus this jump start, if you will, by constructing the two-stage ditch, were they different? And what we noticed is that the quality of the soils on these floodplains, the soils and sediments on these floodplains, were different in the naturalized versus the two-stage constructed floodplain. And let me show you how that changed things. So basically the take home is that the restoration or construction of those two-stage floodplains really jump-started nitrogen removal. and it was due to the organic matter in those soils. So here's the denitrification rate comparing the naturalized floodplains. This is, again, nitrogen removal. Now it's expressed per unit dry mass of those soils per hour. Here's naturalized, and then here's the two-stage. So denitrification was about 30% higher in the constructed floodplains of the two-stage compared to the naturalized system. And the reason that was really around the organic matter. Carbon is needed for those microbes to do the denitrification process, and there was more carbon, more organic material in the restored or constructed floodplains compared to the naturalized ones. They were more sandy. So about a 22% difference in organic matter content as percent organic matter in the floodplains of the two-stage. That really drove higher denitrification. The naturalized floodplains were sandy. It was sort of sediments that were accumulating naturally, but it was these sandy sediments rather than organic rich soils. So another thing I want to talk to you about is the opportunities we've had around more recent two-stage construction that's happened in the Chateau beyond the 2007 original reach. Through the RCPP, USDA RCPP program, we got funded a number of years ago to start the Indiana Watershed Initiative. We were able to add some new construction in 2017 and 2018. Remember, here's the original 2007 half mile. Then we added a length in 2017 and then another length in 2018 using that funding. And remember, the flow goes from the bottom corner up to the top here. And so in 2007, we started with that half mile that I showed you. And then in 2017 and 2018, we added a total of 3.6 more miles of floodplain construction. But it was a little different, and it allowed us to ask some different questions. The NRCS led that effort to install the two-stage, and they did some stream dredging to adjust the grade. That's quite different than the first reach, where we didn't touch that main channel at all. So here's now the main channel, stream dredging plus two-stage construction. And so now the two-stage at the Chateau Ditch is about 75% of the entire stream length, the waterway length of the Chateau. And basically all that's left to do is remove forest, which we won't do. So this is as much we can do in this small system. It's got as much two-stage as it can get. And so it was an exciting opportunity to study water quality during construction. Especially with dredging. So my student, Matt Trentman, who's now out at Montana, and works for the state of Montana, he did a chapter from his dissertation where he measured the turbidity as they were constructing. So he sat downstream and collected water samples, and you can see when they started dredging, this is when they were building the floodplains, no change in turbidity. There's the little shot of the water sample. And then here's as they started the stream dredging portion, you can see what the water column looked like. It went up to about 300 NTU, which is like a big, big storm. What's interesting is when they stop constructing, it also starts to go right back down. But did it have any residual effects on sediment mobilization? And we found it did. Over the course of about 9 months, Matt did some grab sample or used the Hydrolab Minisons to measure turbidity upstream and downstream of the construction reach. And if the data sit above the 1-to-1 line, it means it's more turbid than the downstream has higher turbidity than the upstream, meaning that there's an impact. And you can see by about 9 months out, we start to not see any impact of construction. But for a while there, any increase in flow increased mobilization of sediments, and you get higher turbidity coming from that construction reach. So there is an impact that lasts a little while, but it does recover. And so if you add the stream dredging along with the floodplain construction, there is a sort of a water quality cost to that, but it's not a forever cost. Finally, some of the last results I want to present to you is what happens over a storm event. That's something that we've been asked, like, do these floodplain sediments start denitrifying immediately? How long does it take them to ramp up during an event? And it turns out it's very quick. So here's about a 4 or 5 day storm event that my former student Shannon Spear studied. And here's denitrification rate on the Y, that nitrogen removal. And here it is, she measured, this was a wet period. The floodplains were saturated, so they're soft, but not inundated. And then here's inundation, immediate jump in denitrification as that high nitrate water is delivered to those sediments. And then on the receding limb, as it starts to come back down in terms of flow, you also have high denitrification. So what it shows is this inundation of those floodplains with high nitrate stormwater stimulates denitrification in the floodplain soils. So if I could sort of wrap up, what we know about these systems is, at least this particular system, which I think is quite typical of an agricultural waterway, is that N removal via denitrification is high. There's a lot of nitrate and there's quite a lot of carbon to fuel that process, both in the waterway and in the floodplain. And when you compare average denitrification rates overall, this is sort of a summary model that Shannon did in one of her papers, those rates are not different from each other, right? They're denitrifying at a high rate, and it's similar between streams and floodplains. The capacity, though, because these systems, the floodplains are only working usually during inundation when they're wet, is a little bit less. It represents about a 25% N removal capacity compared to the removal capacity in the main waterway, because that's always wet. So that's always denitrifying. But then the real issue is not the actual rate at which these systems can remove nitrogen, but how much nitrogen do they remove relative to what's coming downstream. And in this particular system, which is, as I mentioned, quite high nitrate, it's only about 10%, say 9 to 14% over, there's some interannual variability, let's say about 10% of the nitrogen load. So we can't rely solely on a waterway conservation practice to do the whole job for a watershed. We need conservation on the surrounding watershed, like say cover crops to help boost the effective conservation. And finally, just wanted to mention that, yes, storms are when this is most important, but the tile drains emptying onto the floodplain during base flow conditions is important too. And we've done some tracer studies to show here's a tile drain onto the floodplain, and you watch this trickle of water move toward the stream. And as it's moving toward the stream, it's denitrifying. And if you make it a longer meander, you get more reduction of nitrogen. That percent nitrogen removal can be 60% over 25 or 30 meters compared to if you only go a straight shot right to the stream. So the early practice was to rip-wrap at tile outlets, and that added cost, but also reduced that bioreactivity. So now we sort of advise, don't rip-wrap, let it meander across the floodplain and you'll get more removal. So the take home is retaining the tile drain flow on the benches is also during base flow can improve N removal efficacy as well. So these systems can work even during base flow. Okay, so what are the take homes and what are the challenges? Well, I think the two-stage is definitely a potential tool in the nutrient management toolbox. It can improve water quality while working with productive agriculture. It is becoming more popular, I think. But there are some best practices to maximize function on these floodplains. You want the floodplains to be built low enough so they inundate regularly, basically every big storm, 10 or 12 events per year. You want it to flow onto the floodplains. You want to retain tile outflows for as long as possible so it can do work during base flow. And of course, I think it goes without saying, you want it to be vegetated. People have said, they've asked to mow, should we mow the floodplains? And no, we leave vegetation on there. There's more nitrogen retention capacity. And that really does seem to age well over time. The cost, which is probably one of the biggest questions that folks have, very important one, is about $10 per linear foot. There could, of course, be economies of scale. They're typically implemented in 1 mile segments. That's just how the distance between one road and another around Indiana. It's about 50. So this would be, if you do two-sided, about $52,000 per mile. That's a one-time cost, though, because there's no post-construction maintenance for the two-stage. It's very stable and self-maintaining. And in Indiana, NRCS EQIP incentive covers about 75%. It's under the open channel design. It's code 582. Ohio's done similar. I think it's, I don't know what code number or if it's the same. I'm just an ecologist, but I know that through their H2O Ohio program, they're now promoting the two-stage. And I did see the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative latest call had the two-stage called out as a shovel-ready practice for EPA funding in the Great Lakes Basin. So I think it is gaining popularity. But I really want to mention the big challenge, and that's offsetting the land lost to construction. So here's that conventional ditch, right? And so you've got water, the ditch bank, then some sort of grass buffer, usually here in Indiana, and then your field. If you produce the two-stage, right? If you do the two-stage, you're losing some arable, you're losing croppable acres right through this. So this is the new floodplain. Then you've got the ditch bank, and you've lost land of production. Who's paying for that? And that's about a 1.2 acre per side per mile of two-stage. And so that's the real hurdle of the two-stage implementation. 2.4 acres of croppable land per mile of two-stage. If you do a two-sided one, and right now there isn't an incentive to take care of that piece. I think that there are ways we could think about it with clever conservation. What if in this new grass area you planted high $1 pollinated grasses or native grasses, or get some other ecosystem benefits? There could be ways. Conservation reserve. Yeah, it's a big challenge, but I wanted to acknowledge that hurdle. And so the farmers that have put it in, the landowners that have put it in thus far, really have contributed some of their croppable acres to the practice. So closing thoughts: two-stage ditch is an effective conservation practice. We've now documented these water quality benefits for nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment retention. Pairs well with the landscape and edge of field conservation practices that we know work. It can be pitched as an upgrade to existing rural/agricultural infrastructure. Rather than a practice, it's more like an infrastructure change, maintaining drainage and adding resilience during this new future in terms of storms. But really, in order to upscale this at the scale of sort of the Midwestern Corn Belt, we really need a conceptual reframing of agricultural drainage and its role that it plays in conservation and water quality improvements. And I think that's where the work lies moving forward. And finally, new NRCS practice standards could increase two-stage miles, but really you need something, a public-private partnership or economic incentives. Something needs to be there to really get widespread implementation, because people landowners can't contribute croppable acres in this way for free. And with that, thank you so much. Lot of partners to make this happen. The Soil and Water Conservation District in Kosciuszko County, wonderful partners, funding from USDA, Walton Family Foundation, Indiana Soybean Alliance, the Nature Conservancy, and partnerships with USGS. But most of all, two things. Thank you to the farmers and landowners. They could not have done this work without their insight and partnership. And then Todd Royer at IU is my sort of partner in crime, and to acknowledge Dr. Shannon Spear and Dr. Matt Trenton, who a lot of their dissertation was on the two-stage. And so thank you to them for their hard work. Thanks so much. Oh, I know, sorry, Matt, I was supposed to say, I don't know if you say it or I say it, but I'm supposed to show you this slide about continuing education units, CEUs. Here is the information about that. And to pitch the next webinar, which it makes me almost tear up. this is my former student, Peter Levi, many years ago. I'll tune in to Peter's seminar on discovering variation in water quality across an otherwise uniform landscape. So great pitch for Peter on March 30th. But I'll put that back up in case you want me to leave that, Matt.
Yeah. Yep. So I'll so if folks can email if they need the CCA CEU, email Liz Ripley, ejukums@iastate.edu by 5 today with your name and the name you entered to watch the webinar, as well as your CCA and the other thing number there. Okay, we have time for questions, and we got questions. This is awesome. Excellent presentation, Dr. Tank, and there are lots of questions, so we'll try to kind of get through as many as we can. And I think there are a couple on this, and I think you touched on it toward the end, but
should I escape out? What should I do?
I think you could, yeah, maybe unshare your screen and then we can go back, but then folks can see you full screen if, yeah, okay. The sediment that deposits on those floodplain benches, I think you talked about this, but the question was, do the benches not require a similar amount of maintenance to the traditional system?
It's a fantastic question. So Jessica D'Ambrosio, who works for TNC now, she was the PhD student that measured the accumulation rate on those benches along those 6 different systems that we studied. There is measurable accumulation, but it's on the order of like millimeters per year. And then what we think happens is the big events, like the beyond 100-year, like 200 to 500-year events that seem to happen every few years around here. Those do the flushing. So yes, it probably is a sort of a reorganization, sort of a setback of the system. And those probably end up in the Tippecanoe and eventually in the Gulf of Mexico. But my point is that over the time periods we've been looking, is greater than 20 year, there is no need for maintenance of those benches. So I think it's the natural system, like natural floodplains in natural waterways, which are sort of at they're sort of at a steady state, if you will.
All right. So next one is shadow ditch. The 2-stage. There's kind of this person indicated shameless plug, but is the shadow ditch the 2-stage ditch that will be a stop on the Conservation Drainage Network annual meeting field trip on April 8th?
Oh, I wish.
Okay.
It wasn't. Right. I wish, but it was not close enough to Fort Wayne. It was too far of a drive, but my lab manager, Ursula Mall, will be at the other one.
Okay. So that, yeah, and a plug to, people can still register, I think, right, Keegan, for that meeting. Okay. The next one, though, kind of a couple have asked us, have you experienced any regulatory barriers to installing the 2-stage ditches? This person indicated there have been issues in Illinois due to the potential increase in channel discharge.
Yep, I would say that's a no on in our experience. But I wonder, so I could be sort of immune to this conversation that may be happening in the background, because our county surveyors have been so so supportive. And so maybe these conversations about that are happening somewhere else, and we're not seeing it. What we do document, though, is channel holding capacity increases, and we're not seeing bank full or overbank. We're seeing bank full, but not overbank events, even in the most extreme precipitation, like rain on snow, like that picture I showed you. So this conversation could be happening in the background, but I do think the partnership with the drainage, however drainage is managed in the particular states, having that sort of partnership and those folks talking to the landowners directly, along with the Soil and Water Conservation District or the NRCS, the DC, and those are all the cogs in the wheel that makes it work. And I have seen that firsthand, for sure.
Next one, when designing the 2-stage ditch, how do you determine the depth of the central channel?
Yeah, remember the depth of the central channel is what it is. And actually, we hope, So at least from our water quality monitoring, the lowest impact was when you just pulled the floodplains away and did not touch the main channel and let sort of natural those fast velocities during high flows keep that main channel at depth. But the height of the bench is really the key figure. And I'll tell you how we did it for that first half mile. We went upstream to all those unmanaged reaches. Remember the naturalized reaches that I talked about earlier in the presentation? We measured the height of those and they were just solidly the same. It was like 9 inches, 10 inches, 9 inches from the bottom of the stream to those naturalized floodplains. So that's how we decide. We're like, we're going to mimic Mother Nature. We're going to make them that height. Fast forward to 2017 when the NRCS, the engineers did that, right? The NRCS, the state engineers, and they have complicated formulas, spreadsheets, etc., and decide what height the bench is going to be. But it is sort of mimicking the natural floodplain bench height. If you make them for only inundate at a 500-year event, it can help with extreme like bank failure, but it doesn't help with the everyday storm that happens 10 or 12 times a year.
Because maybe on a couple water quality questions of it, and then a couple management. So maybe two parts. One is, what is the ultimate fate of the sediment and SRP that may settle out? And then the other is, do you have any data on N2O emissions from the floodplain areas?
Oh, I have a slide about N2O emissions. Yes. But let me first, I took that out. Sorry, I love it. There's somebody deeply into the biogeochemistry here. Love. But on the fate of the phosphorus, it's the fate of any phosphorus that's associated with. So I think it's the loosely sorbed stuff could be used to build microbial biomass or plant biomass. And if it stays on those stable floodplains with that vegetated floodplain system, it could happen to what happens to any sort of phosphorus. If it's there temporarily and then a 500-year event comes through and really sort of pushes that floodplain system to the max and you lose some sediment downstream, it ends up in the tippy canoe or the Wabash. And so I think that is our, to prevent it from ever coming in the first place is probably our best call. So it's a great point. People have talked about how can we harvest, but we don't want to do anything with that vegetation once it's there. So I wouldn't say going in and pulling off the top layer. It's a thought. It does come back quickly, but yeah, it's a big disturbance to do it.
N2O.
Oh, N2O. Yes, not more. So still, okay, I'm not dissing farm fields or whatever, but still, so they behave just like natural floodplains, especially when they're inundated. So when those soils on the floodplains are inundated, it pushes more to N2. So instead of stopping at N2O, continues all the way to N2 in the sort of denitrification pathway. And we see what we call N2O yields, the relative N2O amount to N2 right in there with natural floodplains. And it's still a lot less than terrestrial environments. So it's a good choice, especially when wet.
And this individual asked how the
paper out. I can email someone a paper.
Okay. Yeah, that might be good because the next question was about how the N2O was measured. So it was
measured with the membrane inlet mass spectroscopy and field deployed chambers on the floodplain, but I can totally send the paper.
Okay. Yeah, if you send it, then I can pass that on. Okay. There were any studies on the wildlife benefits, and then kind of along with that, were the two-stage ditches seeded after construction or allowed to naturally revegetate?
Such great questions. Yes. So I think that so I'm not a wildlife biologist and we don't have a wildlife biology department here, unfortunately, but I think anecdotally, there's that's some good habitat. And I think there are sort of bonus co-benefits, if you will, on that. I'll add one little, if I can call a macroinvertebrate, an aquatic insect wildlife, which it is. and fish, little fish, we saw in the first 5 or so years after construction, in every reach that we've worked in, suddenly you start to see the caddisflies, which are usually very sensitive to water quality impacts, especially sediment. Caddisflies that make their cases out of corn leaves. So the corn stover that ends up in the stream becomes the case. They're surviving, they're crawling all over the bottom of the stream, and little young aviaire fish. So when you go to take a water sample, all the fish scatter. And this is way up in the top of the reef, 4 miles from the Tippecanoe. So I think the increase in water clarity that goes throughout the entire year, but especially during storms, is just creating better habitat for your aquatic insects and fish that just couldn't take it when the system was so cloudy so frequently. It's probably stretching wildlife beyond its terminology, but I will do it anyway.
So, kind of a practical question. They're curious where the dirt was put after it was removed.
Yeah, that's a conversation with the landowner. Some will say, yeah, put it right on the edge, in the end, but keep it out of my end rows. Or others will say, I don't want it anywhere near. So it's really, that does add costs. So when I said $10 per linear foot, it was spread thinly at the top of the, so right where that new grass buffer strip would be, that's where that was. But if you had to take that away, and someone didn't want it, then that would add cost.
So this individual is from in northeastern Wisconsin. So it's great to get so many states represented here today. They've done a few miles of 2-stage ditch up there with some more coming up. They are recommending mowing of the benches once a year to maintain woody vegetation and invasive growth. Do you think that mowing versus not mowing makes that big an impact on the reductions achieved?
It's a great question. I'll tell you an alternative for woody vegetation. So woody vegetation cannot establish if that floodplain is flooding frequently enough. It's not so low that it's a wetland, right? That it's a wetland that you get, wetland plants. It's in between, but it's not so dry that you actually get woody vegetation. And so we've had 0 woody vegetation anywhere along those 4 miles because it's inundating with basically any rise in flow. So thinking about lowering those floodplains, and listen, there are so Andy Ward also did some early work on what was called natural channel design before he settled on the 2-stage. And natural channel design is just take it bank to bank bare and then let nature make the floodplain. And it's going to build up to the level that is sort of via the hydraulics of the channel. You can't really harm by going low. That should be like a bumper sticker. Go low. 2-stage ditch, go low.
This individual was interested in kind of a one-sided. If you seen any interest in a one-sided ditch, maybe implemented on rural roadside ditches, so that the road serves as one side, but then kind of one 2-stage just on the one side.
Yep, it works. So I was skeptical. I was worried, but the $2018 that got put in with the EQIP from the RCPP, our $2018, a reach of that about a half mile was along our road and the county road, and it works. It was, I would say, a little extra wide on the other side. And so I wonder if the dissipation of energy of the high flow during storms just sort of spread even further out. So it was almost a double wide, not quite, but a little bit wider on the other side. But then you had the sloping gradient, and it was a pretty shallow slope towards the road edge. But then it's got all that good grasses on the road edge. So I think it's very positive. And we've seen no problems and no compromise in water quality. It's a great idea, though. We haven't studied that reach separately from all the other ones, and we could to see if, could you quantify the actual surface area and say this is the benefit for this surface area? It's a great idea.
Okay. maybe the last one in the interest of time, because we've taken up a lot of your schedule. But are there any studies that you're aware of highlighting cost savings of the two-stage ditch as it might pertain to crop loss due to flooding of the unmanaged surface waters?
I wish. So good. Such a great question. There aren't that many. I don't even have the grand tally of how many miles out there, but I would say we're at the little germination seed of a practice. So what's wide open, but with programs like GLRI, saying put in the two-stage ditch and we'll give you the money type of thing all through the Great Lakes region, I think we've got lots more opportunities to talk about that and measure that. So I'd say yes, go for it. Awesome.
Right. With that, just as a reminder, if you need the CCA CEU, email that to ejukums@iastate.edu by 5 today. And then other thing, I'm going to put just a little shameless plug. Obviously, we have next week's webinar, but today at 3:10 actually, Dr. Antonio Malorino will be giving the Iowa Nutrient Research Center seminar talking about phosphorus loss from infield practices. So if you go to the Iowa Nutrient Research Center website, you can find a link for that. Actually, I'll quickly post a link to information about that in the chat box. Dr. Tank, I want to thank you so much for an excellent, stimulating presentation. Excellent presentation as always, but I really appreciated it and learned a lot. And I think as evidenced by the number of questions, there's a lot of interest in this. And so, we'll look forward to kind of following this and hopefully getting some in Iowa in the future as well. So give you the last word if you have any last words.
Yeah, just a huge thank you for the opportunity. What an honor, Matt. And this is clearly an amazing audience. So wish you all the best and just appreciate the opportunity. So thanks.
Well, thank you for taking the time today. And thank you everybody else for taking the time to get on, and please tune in for future ones or go back and watch some archived ones.